Part 1. The Tiny Island. There is an atoll in the central Pacific, a ring of coral surrounding a lagoon, so small that you could walk its length in less than an hour. Before November 1943, almost no one outside the region had heard of it. The name meant nothing to Americans preparing for war in the Pacific. The atoll was called Tarawa, and the largest island in that atoll, a sliver of coral and sand, barely 3 miles long and 800 yards wide at its widest point, was called Betio. On this tiny piece of land, over a period of 76 hours in November 1943, more than 6,000 men would become casualties. American Marines would storm fortified beaches against withering fire. Japanese defenders would fight to the last man. The lagoon would run red with blood. And America would learn in the most brutal way possible just how costly the road to Tokyo would be. This is the story of Tarawa. Not the entire battle, which included other islands in the atoll, but specifically the assault on Betio. 76 hours of combat so intense that veterans of other Pacific battles would say they had never seen anything like it. A battle that shocked the American public when they saw the first uncensored photographs of American dead on a beach. It's a story about courage and sacrifice, about the fog of war and the friction of amphibious assault, about young men facing impossible odds and doing impossible things, about lessons learned in blood that would save lives in later battles. Over the next 90 minutes, we're going to explore this battle from its planning through its aftermath. We'll meet the men who fought there and try to understand what they endured. We'll see how a battle that lasted less than 4 days left scars that would last lifetimes. Let's begin with the island itself and why it mattered. Betio is part of the Gilbert Islands, a group of atolls roughly halfway between Hawaii and Australia. In peacetime, it would be considered paradise by most standards. Clear blue water, coral reefs, palm trees swaying in tropical breezes, the kind of place people dream about visiting. But Betio in November 1943 was not paradise. It was a fortress. The Japanese had occupied the Gilbert Islands since early in the war, and they had spent months turning Betio into one of the most heavily defended positions in the Pacific. The island's strategic value lay in its airfield. Japanese bombers and fighters based at Tarawa could threaten American shipping lanes and bases. Conversely, if the Americans controlled Tarawa, they would have an airfield closer to the Japanese-held Marshall Islands and Mariana Islands, the next steps in the Central Pacific offensive. The Japanese understood Betio's importance. They had fortified every inch of it. They built bunkers of reinforced concrete, some with walls several feet thick. They positioned coastal defense guns in steel and concrete emplacements. They strung barbed wire along the beaches. They built obstacles and barriers in the lagoon to prevent landing craft from reaching shore. The garrison numbered about 4,800 men, a mix of elite naval troops and construction workers turned soldiers. They were well-equipped, well-supplied, and commanded by Rear Admiral Keiji Shibasaki, who had boasted that 1,000,000 men cannot take Tarawa in 100 years. Admiral Shibasaki's confidence was not entirely unfounded. Betio was perhaps the most heavily defended island of its size in the world. Every approach was covered by interlocking fields of fire. Every beach had multiple defensive positions. The island was, quite literally, a coral fortress. The American decision to assault Tarawa was part of a larger offensive in the Central Pacific. Admiral Chester Nimitz, commanding Pacific forces, had decided to drive west through the Central Pacific, while General Douglas MacArthur drove north from the Southwest Pacific. The two offensives would converge on the Philippines and eventually Japan itself. Tarawa was the first step in Nimitz's offensive. Taking the Gilbert Islands would provide bases for the next leap to the Marshalls. But this would be the first American assault on a heavily defended atoll. The techniques and tactics were still being developed. The Marines who would storm Betio would be learning as they fought. The 2nd Marine Division was given the mission. These were tough, professional troops, veterans of Guadalcanal. They were confident, well-trained, and eager to prove themselves again. But nothing in their experience had prepared them for what awaited at Tarawa. The division was commanded by Major General Julian Smith, a capable and experienced officer. He understood the challenges of amphibious assault and had concerns about the operation. His Marines would be landing across a coral reef that surrounded the island. Landing craft would have to cross this reef to reach the beaches. Navy planners assured him that the tide would be high enough for landing craft to pass over the reef. But there was uncertainty. The tides in the Central Pacific were not fully understood. What if the tide was lower than expected? What if the landing craft grounded on the reef, forcing Marines to wade hundreds of yards to shore under fire? General Smith requested additional landing vehicles that could cross the reef regardless of tide. He got some, but not enough. The assault would proceed with a combination of standard landing craft that needed high tide and amphibious tractors that could cross the reef. It would have to be enough. The date was set, November 20th, 1943, D-Day for Tarawa. Part 2. The plan? The plan for taking Betio was straightforward in concept, but complex in execution. 3 battalions of Marines would land simultaneously on the northern beaches of the island. These beaches, designated Red 1, Red 2, and Red 3, faced the lagoon and offered the best approaches. The assault would be preceded by massive bombardment. Battleships and cruisers would shell the island for hours. Aircraft would bomb it. The goal was to destroy Japanese defenses and kill or stun the defenders before the Marines landed. Then the Marines would storm ashore, push inland, and secure the island in a few days at most. The plan assumed that the bombardment would be effective, that Japanese positions would be destroyed or at least suppressed, that the defenders would be disorganized and demoralized when the Marines landed. These assumptions would prove tragically wrong. The naval bombardment began before dawn on November 20th. The heavy guns of battleships and cruisers fired salvo after salvo into Betio. The island disappeared in smoke and flame. Explosions erupted across its length. From the ships offshore, it looked like nothing could survive. Aircraft joined the bombardment, dropping bombs on identified targets. Pilots reported good hits, fires burning, defenses destroyed. Everything seemed to be going according to plan. But the Japanese were deep in their bunkers, waiting. The concrete and steel emplacements could withstand everything except a direct hit by the largest shells. Most shells fell on open ground or destroyed structures that weren't militarily significant. The defensive positions, the machine gun nests and artillery emplacements largely survived. When the bombardment lifted and the landing craft began their run to the beaches, the Japanese emerged from their bunkers and manned their weapons. The fortress was still intact. The defenders were ready, and the Marines were about to learn just how deadly those defenses were. The first waves of Marines climbed into their amphibious tractors in the pre-dawn darkness. These vehicles, called Amtracs or LVTS, could cross the reef and deliver Marines directly to the beach. They were the key to the assault plan, the vehicles that would get the first waves ashore quickly. But there weren't enough of them. Only the first 3 waves would ride in Amtracs. Subsequent waves would come in standard landing craft that had to stop at the reef if the tide was too low. And the tide on this particular day was indeed too low. The coral reef that surrounded Betio was exposed, blocking the landing craft. The Marines in the first waves didn't know this yet. They sat in their Amtracs, weapons ready, trying to control their fear and adrenaline. Some were veterans of Guadalcanal. They knew what combat was like. Others were newer, had trained extensively, but had never been in battle. All of them were about to experience something that would exceed their worst expectations. The Amtracs formed up and began their long run to the beaches. It was several miles from the ships to the island, and the Amtracs were slow, especially when loaded with Marines and equipment. The ride took nearly an hour of anticipation and growing tension. As the Amtracs approached the island, Japanese fire began. Artillery shells fell among the vehicles. Machine guns opened up. Some Amtracs were hit and disabled, spilling Marines into the lagoon. Others kept going, their engines straining, their thin armor no protection against the hail of fire. The Marines crouched in the Amtracs, unable to return fire effectively, just enduring as the vehicles ground toward the beaches. Some prayed, some checked their weapons repeatedly, some simply tried to make themselves as small as possible. The noise was overwhelming, the engine, the gunfire, the explosions, the shouts of men, and then they hit the beach. Part 3. Red Beach. The Amtraks carrying the first wave of Marines ground up onto the beaches of Betio at approximately 9:13 in the morning. The ramps dropped, Marines poured out, weapons ready, and ran forward into a hell of fire. The Japanese had held their fire during much of the approach, waiting for the Marines to reach the beach, where they would be most vulnerable. Now they unleashed everything. Machine guns swept the beach, mortars fell with devastating accuracy. Snipers picked off individual Marines. Artillery shells exploded among the assault waves. Marines fell everywhere. Some were hit before they even got out of the Amtraks. Others made it a few yards before going down. The survivors pushed forward, looking for cover, trying to return fire, struggling to understand what was happening in the chaos. The beach itself offered almost no cover. It was a narrow strip of sand and coral backed by a seawall about 4 feet high. Marines who reached the seawall found some protection. But getting there meant crossing open ground swept by fire. Many didn't make it. The seawall became the initial objective. Get to the wall, take cover, organize, then figure out how to get over it and push inland. But getting to the wall was its own battle. Marines crawled, ran, dragged wounded comrades. Officers and NCOs tried to maintain unit cohesion, tried to get their men moving, often becoming casualties themselves. Lieutenant William Dean Hawkins led his scout sniper platoon in attacks on Japanese positions along the seawall. His men used flamethrowers and demolitions to clear bunkers, dangerous work that got them killed rapidly. Hawkins himself was wounded but continued to fight, leading assault after assault until he was killed. He would be awarded the Medal of Honor posthumously. Behind the first wave came the second and third waves in their Amtraks. They met the same storm of fire. More Amtraks were disabled, more Marines were killed or wounded before they even reached shore. The beach was becoming crowded with casualties and with men pinned down by fire. And then came the fourth wave. These Marines were in standard landing craft, not Amtraks. The landing craft approached the reef and stopped, unable to cross. The coxswains lowered the ramps. The Marines had a choice: stay in the boats and die, or get out and wade 500 to 700 yards to shore under fire. They got out. There was no other option. They climbed over the sides of the landing craft into chest-deep water and began the long wade to shore. They carried rifles and packs and ammunition. They struggled through the water, trying to move quickly, becoming exhausted within minutes. The Japanese fire was constant. Marines were hit and disappeared beneath the water. Others were wounded and struggled to stay afloat, weighed down by their equipment. Some drowned despite not being hit. The wade to shore became a nightmare, hundreds of men struggling through the water while machine gun fire churned the surface around them. Those who made it to shore were exhausted, soaked, and traumatized. Many had lost their weapons in the water. Many had seen friends killed. All of them were about to join the fight on the beach, where Marines were still pinned against the seawall, unable to advance more than a few yards inland. By mid-morning, the situation on Betio was desperate. Hundreds of Marines were ashore, but they were pinned down. Casualties were mounting rapidly. Communication with the command ship offshore was sporadic. Naval gunfire support was hitting the island, but couldn't suppress all the Japanese positions. Ammunition was running low for the Marines on the beach. Water was scarce. The tropical sun beat down mercilessly. Wounded men lay in the sand, some being treated by corpsmen, others dying for lack of treatment. The dead were everywhere, American and Japanese, bodies lying in grotesque positions. Colonel David Shoup, commanding the assault forces on shore, established his command post just behind the seawall on Red Beach 2. He was wounded himself, hit by shrapnel, but refused evacuation. From his exposed position, he tried to coordinate the battle, calling for fire support, reorganizing units, pushing his Marines to attack inland. Shoup's leadership was crucial. In the chaos and carnage of the beach, his presence gave Marines a focus. His orders, shouted over the noise of battle or relayed by runners, provided direction. His refusal to leave despite his wounds set an example. He would later receive the Medal of Honor for his actions that day. But leadership could only do so much. The Marines needed to get off the beach, to push inland, to reduce the Japanese bunkers that were causing so many casualties. And that required men to stand up, to expose themselves to fire, to attack positions that seemed impregnable. Some Marines did exactly that. Small groups would coordinate, suppress a bunker with rifle fire, then assault it with grenades or flamethrowers. It was brutal, close-quarters fighting. Many attackers were killed, but slowly, yard by yard, Marines pushed inland. Part 4. The First Night. As the sun set on November 20th, the Marines on Betio were still clinging to narrow beachheads. They had pushed inland in some areas, perhaps 100 yards or more. In other areas, they were still pinned against the seawall. The day had been catastrophic in terms of casualties. Hundreds were dead, hundreds more wounded. The Marines dug in for the night, expecting Japanese counterattacks. In previous battles, the Japanese had often attacked at night in mass charges designed to overwhelm American positions. The Marines set up machine guns, positioned mortars, established defensive perimeters as well as they could. The night brought some relief from the heat and from the visibility that had made every movement dangerous during the day. But it brought its own terrors. In the darkness, every sound might be an approaching enemy. Flares were fired, illuminating the battlefield in harsh white light that created deep shadows. Marines fired at sounds and movements, sometimes killing Japanese infiltrators, sometimes killing nothing. The Japanese did attempt to attack in places, but not in the mass charges that characterized earlier battles. They had learned that such attacks were suicidal. Instead, they probed American positions, looking for weak points. They infiltrated between units. They tried to sow confusion and fear. Some Japanese soldiers fought to the death. Others, knowing they were trapped with no hope of survival or relief, committed suicide. The sounds of these suicides, shots ringing out in the darkness, added to the surreal horror of the night. The Marines on the beach had limited supplies. Water was critically short. Medical supplies were inadequate for the number of wounded. Food was whatever each Marine had carried ashore. Communications were still spotty. Some units had lost contact with higher command and were fighting on their own initiative. Offshore, on the command ship, senior officers tried to understand what was happening on Betio. The reports were fragmented and often contradictory. Some sectors seemed to be making progress, others were in serious trouble. The casualty figures were much higher than expected. The battle was not going according to plan. The question arose, should reinforcements be sent in immediately, or should they wait until morning when the situation might be clearer? The decision was made to commit reserves. More Marines would land during the night and early morning, reinforcing the beachheads, bringing fresh troops to continue the attack. These reserve units would face the same deadly wade across the reef that earlier waves had endured. The landing craft still couldn't cross the reef. Marines still had to climb into chest-deep water and make the long approach to shore. But there was no alternative. The Marines on Betio needed reinforcement if they were going to survive and complete the mission. On the beaches, Marines tried to rest when they could. They cleaned weapons, reloaded magazines, shared water when they had any. They helped treat the wounded, moving them to collection points where corpsmen could work on them. They dealt with the dead as best they could, moving bodies to one side, trying to maintain some respect in impossible conditions. Some Marines wrote letters home, knowing they might not survive the next day. Others prayed. Others simply sat in stunned silence, trying to process what they had experienced. The veterans of Guadalcanal said they had never seen anything like this. The intensity of fire, the closeness of combat, the sheer number of casualties in such a small space. It was beyond anything they had imagined. As dawn approached on the second day, November 21st, the Marines prepared to attack again. They had survived the first day, though just barely. Now they had to push inland, had to break the Japanese defenses, had to take the island. There was no other option. They had come too far and lost too much to fail now. Part 5. The second day dawn. On November 21st found the Marines in a slightly better position than the night before. Reinforcements had come ashore during the night. Supplies, including water and ammunition, had been landed. The beachheads were more secure, but the Japanese still held most of the island, and they were still fighting hard. The plan for the second day was to push inland from all three beaches, link up the separate beachheads, and begin clearing the island systematically. Tanks that had finally made it ashore would support the infantry. Artillery was being set up, naval gunfire and air support would continue to pound Japanese positions. But the reality was still brutal. Every bunker had to be assaulted directly. The Japanese defenders fought from their fortified positions until they were killed or the positions were destroyed. They didn't surrender. They didn't retreat. They fought until they died. Marines developed tactics on the spot for dealing with the bunkers. A tank would approach, firing its main gun into the bunker's aperture. Infantry would follow, throwing grenades or using flamethrowers to clear the inside. Engineers would come up with demolitions to seal the entrance or collapse the bunker entirely. This process was effective but slow and costly. Every bunker assault meant casualties. Marines would be wounded or killed even in successful attacks. And there were hundreds of bunkers across the island, each one requiring the same dangerous approach. The flamethrower operators were particularly important, but also particularly vulnerable. They had to get close to bunker entrances to direct flame inside. They carried distinctive equipment that made them obvious targets. Many flamethrower operators didn't survive long, but they volunteered anyway, knowing their weapon could save lives by clearing bunkers quickly. Staff Sergeant William Bourdelon, an engineer, repeatedly exposed himself to fire to demolish Japanese positions and clear obstacles. He destroyed several pillboxes with demolitions before being killed by enemy fire. His actions on both the first and second days were crucial to the Marine advance. He would be awarded the Medal of Honor posthumously. As the day progressed, Marines began to make real progress. The three beachheads were connected. Marines pushed inland toward the airfield in the center of the island. Japanese defenders were being compressed into a smaller area, but they continued to fight, exacting a price for every yard of coral and sand. The heat remained oppressive. Marines fought in temperatures over 100 degrees, carrying heavy loads, exerting themselves constantly. Heat casualties continued alongside combat casualties. Men collapsed from exhaustion and dehydration. The corpsmen did what they could, but they were overwhelmed. Water remained critically short. The supplies that had been landed weren't enough for the number of Marines ashore and the conditions they were fighting in. Men shared canteens. They drank from shell holes, risking disease. They became so desperate for water that it occupied their thoughts almost as much as the fighting. The wounded continued to accumulate. The aid stations were overwhelmed. Corpsmen worked without rest, treating a steady stream of casualties. Some wounded men had to wait hours for treatment. Some died waiting. The medical personnel did heroic work, but they couldn't save everyone. By nightfall of the second day, the Marines held perhaps half the island. The Japanese were compressed into the eastern end and into pockets of resistance elsewhere. The battle was being won, but at terrible cost. Casualties for the 2 days exceeded 1,500 killed and wounded. And the fighting wasn't over. Part 6. The Men. Let's pause in our narrative of the battle to consider the men who fought at Tarawa, because behind the tactical descriptions and casualty figures are individual human stories. Take a typical Marine rifle company landing on Betio, about 200 men. Most are in their late teens or early 20s. Some are veterans of Guadalcanal, experienced Marines who know what combat is like. Others are newer, replacements who have trained hard but have never been in battle. The company commander is a captain, maybe 25 years old. He's responsible for these 200 lives. He's studied the maps, knows the plan, understands his objectives. But he also knows that plans rarely survive contact with the enemy. He'll have to make split-second decisions that will determine who lives and who dies. The platoon leaders are lieutenants, often fresh from officer training. They're 22 or 23 years old, leading 40 men into combat for the first time. They've been trained to lead from the front, to set an example. Many of them won't survive the battle. The life expectancy of a second lieutenant in combat is measured in minutes, not hours. The sergeants and corporals are the backbone. They're slightly older, often veterans with combat experience. They know how to keep men alive, how to use terrain, how to suppress enemy fire while advancing. They mentor the younger Marines, teaching them on the job, trying to get them through their first battle alive. And then there are the privates and PFCS, the majority of the company. They come from everywhere. Farm boys who grew up hunting and know how to shoot. City kids who had never held a rifle before boot camp. Boys from wealthy families and boys from poverty. The Marine Corps has made them all into Marines, given them the same training, The same standards, the same expectations. There's a 19-year-old from Iowa, a farmer's son, who's good with his rifle and calm under pressure. There's a 20-year-old from Brooklyn, quick with jokes, trying to keep morale up even when things are at their worst. There's a 22-year-old from Texas, quiet and serious, who follows orders without question and looks after the newer men in his squad. Each of these men has people back home who love them, parents who worry every day, girlfriends or young wives who wait for letters, siblings who look up to them. None of them wants to die on Tarawa. All of them would rather be anywhere else. But they're here, doing what they have to do. They're scared. Anyone who says they weren't scared is lying. You'd have to be insane not to be scared, wading through chest-deep water toward a beach swept by machine gun fire. You'd have to be insane not to be scared assaulting a bunker that's firing at you. The question isn't whether they're scared. The question is whether they can function despite the fear. Most of them do function. They do their jobs. They follow orders. They help their buddies. They fight when they have to fight, and they keep going when everything in them wants to stop. This is courage, not the absence of fear, but functioning despite it. Some don't make it through their first day. They're killed on the beach or during the wade to shore. Their war lasts minutes or hours. Their families will receive telegrams saying, "Killed in action," with no details, no explanation of what happened or why. Just the flat bureaucratic notification of death. Others are wounded. Some wounds are light, treated quickly and then back to the fight. Others are serious, requiring evacuation, months of recovery, permanent disability. Some men lose limbs. Some lose sight. All carry scars, visible and invisible. The corpsmen, the Navy medical personnel attached to Marine units, are in some ways the bravest men on the battlefield. They carry no weapons. Their job is to treat wounded Marines, often under fire. They run through machine gun fire to reach casualties. They perform medical procedures in conditions that would be unthinkable in peacetime. Many are wounded or killed trying to save others. Pharmacist's mate First Class Johnny Hutchins repeatedly exposed himself to enemy fire to treat wounded Marines. He was eventually killed while tending to casualties. His selfless dedication was representative of the corpsmen who served at Tarawa. Many would receive medals for their actions, though medals seem inadequate to recognize what they did. On the Japanese side, the defenders were also young men far from home. They had been told that Tarawa was impregnable, that they would defeat any American attack. They had trained and prepared. They believed in their emperor and their cause. When the attack came, they fought with discipline and determination. They manned their weapons under bombardment. They fired with accuracy and effect. They fought from positions until those positions were destroyed and they were killed. Very few surrendered. Most fought to the death. These Japanese soldiers had families too. Parents, wives, children who would receive notification of death with no details, no body to bury. Their sacrifice, from their perspective, was meaningful. They were defending territory, delaying the American advance, making the enemy pay in blood. That their cause was ultimately lost doesn't change what they endured as individuals. Understanding the humanity on both sides doesn't require us to equate the causes. The United States was fighting a defensive war after being attacked at Pearl Harbor. Japan was the aggressor, pursuing imperial conquest. The two sides were not morally equivalent. But at the level of individual soldiers, there were similarities: fear and courage, duty and sacrifice, young men doing difficult things because they were ordered to. This human element is part of every battle, and it's worth remembering even as we acknowledge the larger context of the war. Part 7. The third day, November 22nd, 1943. The third day of the Battle for Tarawa. The Marines now controlled most of Betio. The Japanese were compressed into the eastern end of the island, fighting from their final defensive positions. The outcome was no longer in doubt. The question was how long it would take and how many more men would die. The Marines attacked at dawn, pushing east along the island's length. Tanks led the way where possible, followed by infantry. The tactics that had been learned over the previous 2 days were now being applied systematically. Bunkers were identified, suppressed with fire, then assaulted. Engineers followed to demolish the positions. The fighting remained intense. The Japanese defenders knew they were in their final hours. They fought with the desperation of men who had nothing to lose. Some positions had to be assaulted multiple times. Marines would think a bunker was cleared, move past it, and then take fire from it again as Japanese soldiers emerged from hidden compartments or tunnels. By mid-afternoon, organized Japanese resistance had largely ceased. Small groups of defenders continued to fight from isolated positions. Individual soldiers fired from spider holes or ruins until they were killed. But the Japanese command structure had broken down. There was no coordinated defense anymore, just individuals and small groups fighting to the end. Colonel Shoup, still directing operations despite his wounds, began to assess what the Marines had accomplished. They had taken Betio in 76 hours of combat. They had overcome defenses that the Japanese had boasted could not be taken. They had done what they had been ordered to do. But the cost made victory taste like ashes. The final casualty figures for the Marines at Tarawa were staggering. Over 1,000 killed, more than 2,000 wounded. These were the highest casualties per day of combat that the Marines had suffered up to that point in the war. On a tiny island barely 3 miles long, more than 3,000 Marines had become casualties in 76 hours. The Japanese garrison was almost entirely wiped out. Of the 4,800 defenders, fewer than 100 survived to be captured, most of them Korean laborers rather than Japanese soldiers. The rest were dead, their bodies scattered across the island or buried in the rubble of collapsed bunkers. The island itself was devastated. The bombardment and fighting had destroyed almost every structure. Palm trees were shattered stumps. The sand was churned and mixed with coral dust and blood. The smell of death hung over everything, a stench that would persist for weeks. The Marines began the grim task of dealing with the dead. Bodies had to be identified when possible, though many were beyond recognition. Temporary graves were dug. Personal effects were collected for return to families. It was heartbreaking work, made worse by the heat and the awareness that these were men they had fought beside just days or hours before. The wounded were evacuated as quickly as possible. Hospital ships offshore received a steady stream of casualties. The doctors and nurses worked around the clock, performing surgeries, treating wounds, trying to save as many as possible. Some wounded men would recover fully. Others would carry their wounds for the rest of their lives. As the fighting ended and the immediate crisis passed, the survivors had time to reflect on what they had experienced. Many were in shock, unable to fully process the intensity and brutality of the previous 76 hours. They had seen friends killed. They had killed. They had come within inches of death themselves. It would take time, in some cases years or decades, to fully understand what they had been through. Some Marines felt pride in what they had accomplished. They had taken an island that was supposed to be impregnable. They had overcome defenses that seemed insurmountable. They had proven the effectiveness of American training and tactics, albeit at terrible cost. Others felt mainly relief. They had survived. They were alive when so many were dead. The guilt of survival, wondering why they had lived when friends had died, would haunt many for years. Still others felt anger. Anger at the cost, at the casualties that seemed excessive, at the planning failures that had made the battle harder than it needed to be. This anger would be directed in various ways, at senior commanders, at the Navy for the tide miscalculation, at the Japanese for fighting so hard, at war itself. All of these reactions were valid. Combat affects different people in different ways. There's no single correct way to respond to what the Marines experienced at Tarawa. On November 23rd, Major General Holland Smith, commanding the 5th Amphibious Corps, came ashore to inspect the island and congratulate the troops. What he saw shocked him, even though he was an experienced combat commander. The carnage was beyond anything he had imagined. Dead bodies everywhere, American and Japanese. Shattered fortifications. The beach still littered with destroyed equipment and floating bodies. Smith later wrote that the sight of Tarawa would haunt him for the rest of his life. The cost of taking this tiny island, the number of young men killed or wounded, the sheer intensity of the fighting in such a small space. It was, he said, hell on earth. But Smith also recognized what the Marines had accomplished. They had proven that even the most heavily fortified positions could be taken by well-trained and determined troops. They had shown that amphibious assault against defended beaches was possible, though costly. The lessons of Tarawa would save lives in later operations. The battle for Betio was officially declared over on November 23, 1943. 76 hours after it began, the American flag was raised over the island. The objective was secured. The first step in the Central Pacific Offensive was complete. But the cost of that first step had shocked everyone involved. And the question that would echo for years was simple. Had it been worth it? Could the battle have been fought differently, with fewer casualties? Or was this level of cost simply the price of war against a determined enemy in fortified positions? These questions have no easy answers, but they're part of Tarawa's legacy, part of what the battle teaches us about war and its costs. Part 8. The Aftermath. In the immediate aftermath of the battle, the practical tasks of securing Betio and dealing with casualties took priority. The island had to be made safe. Unexploded ordnance had to be cleared. Japanese holdouts had to be found and dealt with. The airfield had to be repaired and made operational. Construction equipment was brought ashore. Seabees, the Navy's construction battalions, began repairing the airfield and building facilities. Within days, American aircraft were using the runway that had been the ostensible reason for the battle. The island was being transformed from battlefield to American base. But the human aftermath was harder to manage. The wounded were being treated on hospital ships and at rear area hospitals. Some would recover fully, others would carry permanent disabilities. All would carry memories of Tarawa. The dead were being processed by graves registration units. Where possible, bodies were identified and prepared for burial. Temporary cemeteries were established on the island. Later, the dead would be reinterred in permanent military cemeteries or returned to families if they requested it. Notifying families of casualties was an agonizing process. Telegrams went out to hundreds of homes across America. We regret to inform you, parents opened their doors to find military officers with the worst possible news. Wives became widows, children lost fathers. The pain rippled out from Tarawa to touch communities all across the nation. The survivors had to deal with their own trauma. Some were sent to rear areas for rest and recuperation. Others remained on Tarawa, helping with the cleanup and security. All of them carried the memory of 76 hours of hell. Then something unprecedented happened. Combat photographers had documented the battle at Tarawa, including graphic images of American dead on the beach. These photographs had always existed at other battles, but they had been censored before release to the public. The American people had not seen what combat really looked like. The decision was made to release some of these photographs. The public needed to understand the cost of the war, needed to see what their Marines were enduring. In December 1943, Life magazine published photos of American dead at Tarawa. The images shocked the nation. Americans had been told about casualties, had read about battles, but they had never seen their own dead in this way. The photographs from Tarawa made the war real in a way that nothing else had. These weren't abstract statistics. These were bodies, American boys, lying dead on a beach thousands of miles from home. The public reaction was mixed. Some were horrified and questioned whether such images should be shown. Others felt the photos were necessary, that people needed to understand what war truly cost. The debate over showing casualties would continue throughout the war and beyond. But the photographs from Tarawa had an undeniable impact. They brought the reality of Pacific combat home to Americans in a visceral way. They made people understand that victory was not going to come cheaply, that taking back the Pacific would require sacrifice on a scale few had imagined. The military began a thorough analysis of what had gone right and wrong at Tarawa. The lessons were painful but necessary. The miscalculation of the tides had been costly. Better hydrographic intelligence was needed for future operations. More amphibious tractors were required so Marines wouldn't have to wade through water under fire. The naval bombardment, while impressive, had not been as effective as hoped. Future operations would need longer bombardments with better targeting. The concrete bunkers at Tarawa had proven resistant to everything except direct hits by the largest shells. New tactics and weapons would be needed to deal with such fortifications. Communications had been a major problem. Radio equipment had failed when it got wet. Coordination between units, between shore and ship, between ground and air forces had been difficult. Better waterproof equipment and more reliable communication systems were essential. Medical procedures were also examined. The corpsmen had done heroic work, but the system for evacuating wounded from the beach had broken down under the volume of casualties. Better organization and more medical personnel would be needed in future assaults. Despite the high casualties, there were also successes to build on. The Marines had proven that heavily defended beaches could be taken. They had shown courage and adaptability in the face of unexpected challenges. The small unit leadership had been excellent, with junior officers and NCOs stepping up when senior leaders became casualties. The use of tanks, once they got ashore, had been effective. The combination of tanks, infantry, and engineers working together to reduce bunkers had worked well. This would become standard doctrine for later operations. The intelligence on Japanese defenses, while incomplete, had been better than in earlier battles. Aerial photography and other reconnaissance had given planners a reasonable picture of what the Marines would face. Future operations would benefit from even better intelligence gathering. Within weeks of the battle, these lessons were being incorporated into planning for the next operations. The assault on the Marshall Islands, scheduled for early 1944, would benefit directly from what had been learned at Tarawa. More amphibious tractors were ordered. Bombardment procedures were revised. Communication equipment was improved. The 2nd Marine Division, which had borne the brunt of the fighting at Tarawa, was withdrawn to Hawaii for rest and reconstitution. The division had suffered over 3,000 casualties out of an assault force of perhaps 18,000. It needed time to absorb replacements, to rest the survivors, to rebuild its strength. For the veterans of Tarawa, the time in Hawaii was bittersweet. They were grateful to be away from combat, to have survived, but they carried the weight of what they had experienced. Many struggled with nightmares, with jumpy nerves, with grief for lost friends. There was no formal recognition of combat stress in 1943, no systematic treatment for what we now call PTSD. Men were expected to tough it out, to move on. Part 9. The Legacy. The Battle of Tarawa left several lasting legacies, both military and cultural. Let's explore what this 76-hour battle meant in the larger context of World War II and American military history. Militarily, Tarawa represented a turning point in amphibious warfare doctrine. The lessons learned there directly influenced every subsequent amphibious operation in the Pacific. The assaults on Kwajalein, Saipan, Guam, Iwo Jima, and Okinawa all benefited from what had been learned at Tarawa. The increase in amphibious tractors meant that Marines in later battles could ride all the way to the beach, regardless of tides or reefs. This reduced casualties significantly. The improved bombardment procedures, while they never eliminated all defensive positions, were more effective than they had been at Tarawa. The recognition that concrete bunkers required special attention led to the development of better tactics and weapons for dealing with them. Flamethrowers became more widely used. Demolition techniques were refined. The coordination between supporting arms improved dramatically. In a very real sense, the Marines who died at Tarawa saved lives in later battles. Their sacrifice purchased knowledge that made future operations less costly. This doesn't lessen the tragedy of their deaths, but it does give them meaning. They were the ones who learned, at terrible cost, how to fight this new kind of warfare. Culturally, Tarawa had a profound impact on how Americans viewed the Pacific War. Before Tarawa, the public had a vague understanding that the war in the Pacific was difficult and costly. After Tarawa, especially after the photographs were published, they understood in a visceral way just how brutal Pacific combat was. This understanding would prove important as the war continued. Later battles like Iwo Jima and Okinawa, which were even more costly than Tarawa, did not come as complete shocks to the American public. People understood by then that taking Pacific Islands from determined Japanese defenders was going to be bloody work. The debate over showing casualties, sparked by the Tarawa photographs, would continue throughout the war and into later conflicts. How much should the public see? How graphic should war coverage be? These questions, first seriously addressed in the context of Tarawa, remain relevant today. For the Marine Corps, Tarawa became a defining battle, one that tested the core and proved its mettle. The courage shown on the beaches, the determination to complete the mission despite horrific casualties, the adaptability in the face of unexpected challenges, all of these became part of Marine Corps tradition and culture. Veterans of Tarawa were regarded with special respect within the Corps. They had been through something that even other combat veterans acknowledged was extraordinary. They had earned their place in Marine Corps history alongside the veterans of WWII and other legendary battles. For the families of those who died at Tarawa, the legacy was more personal and painful. They had lost sons, husbands, fathers, brothers. The photographs in Life magazine meant that in some cases they saw images of the beach where their loved ones had died, even if they couldn't identify specific bodies. Some families found comfort in the knowledge that their Marines had died doing their duty, fighting for their country, accomplishing the mission. Others struggled with anger and grief, questioning why so many had to die for such a small island. Both reactions were valid, both were part of how families processed their loss. Gold Star mothers, women who had lost sons in the war, became a recognized group. They shared their grief, supported each other, and in many cases became advocates for their sons' memory. The mothers of Tarawa casualties were part of this larger community of loss. As years passed and World War II moved from current events to history, Tarawa maintained a place in American consciousness that many other battles did not. It was remembered, taught in military schools, commemorated in books and documentaries. The photographs ensured it would not be forgotten. The island of Betio today is part of the nation of Kiribati. The battle site has been preserved to some extent, with memorials to both American and Japanese forces. The concrete bunkers remain, weathered but still recognizable. The beaches where Marines landed are peaceful now, but traces of the battle can still be found. Part 10. The Veterans Remember. As decades passed after Tarawa, the veterans who survived carried their memories of those 76 hours. For some, the memories remained vivid and painful. For others, they faded somewhat with time, though they never disappeared entirely. Veterans organizations provided spaces where Tarawa survivors could connect with others who understood. At reunions, men who had fought on different beaches or in different units would share their experiences, finding common ground in what they had endured. These reunions became more poignant as the veterans aged. Men in their 20s during the battle were in their 70s and 80s at the turn of the 21st century. They knew they were the last generation who could say, "I was there," with the authority of personal experience. Many veterans found they could talk more freely about Tarawa as they aged. The protective mechanisms that had helped them function in the years immediately after the war began to weaken. They found themselves thinking more about the battle, about the friends they had lost, about the young men they had been. Some returned to Tarawa in their later years. The journey was difficult for elderly men, but they felt compelled to go back. Standing on the beaches where they had landed as young Marines, now old men, brought everything back. Many wept for friends long dead, for experiences that had shaped their lives, for the youth they had left on that island. The encounters between American and Japanese veterans who had fought at Tarawa were particularly moving. Men who had tried to kill each other in 1943 met decades later and found they could respect each other, even become friends. They had been soldiers doing their duty on opposite sides of a terrible conflict, but they shared the experience of having been there. These meetings didn't erase the war or change what had happened. The causes each side fought for remained different, and the Americans had been on the right side of that conflict. But at the individual level, former enemies could recognize each other's humanity and courage. As Tarawa veterans reached their 80s and 90s, many felt an urgency to preserve their stories. They gave interviews to historians, they spoke at schools and museums, they wrote memoirs or worked with writers to record their experiences. They wanted future generations to know what had happened at Tarawa, to understand the cost of victory. Their motivations were varied. Some wanted to honor friends who had died. Some wanted to ensure the battle wasn't forgotten. Some wanted young people to understand the reality of war beyond the sanitized versions in movies and video games. Some simply wanted to bear witness, to say, "This happened, I was there, this is what it was like." The last survivors of Tarawa are passing away now. Each year, fewer remain. The youngest veterans, those who were 18 or 19 during the battle, are now in their late 90s or have already passed. Soon, within a few years, there will be no one left who can say they were at Tarawa. When the last veteran dies, Tarawa will pass fully from living memory into history. The battle will exist in photographs, documents, recordings, and monuments, but not in the minds of people who were actually there. This transition is inevitable for all historical events, but it marks a significant change. The stories the veterans told, recorded on video or in written memoirs, become more precious as the number of veterans dwindles. These first-hand accounts capture something that historical analysis cannot: the immediate, personal, emotional reality of the experience. They preserve not just what happened, but what it felt like to be there. Future generations studying Tarawa will have access to more information than previous generations had about most historical battles. The extensive photographic record, the recorded interviews, the detailed after-action reports, all of these provide a rich resource for understanding the battle. But they will miss the opportunity to sit across from a veteran and ask, what was it really like? They will miss the chance to see the emotion in an old man's eyes as he describes landing on Red Beach. They will miss the weight of hearing "I was there" from someone who actually was. This is the natural progression of history. Events move from present to past to distant past. Living memory gives way to recorded memory, gives way to history. Tarawa is making that transition now, in our time, as the last veterans pass away. Part 11. Reflections on Tarawa. As we approach the end of our exploration of Tarawa, let's reflect on what this battle means and why it deserves to be remembered. Tarawa was not the largest battle of World War II, not the most strategically significant, not the most famous, but it was important in ways that extend beyond its immediate military objectives. It was a battle that taught crucial lessons, that tested American forces in new ways, that revealed both the capabilities and limitations of amphibious warfare. The courage displayed at Tarawa was extraordinary. Marines wading through water under fire, knowing they might die at any moment but continuing anyway. Men assaulting bunkers that seemed impossible to take. Corpsmen running into fire to treat wounded. Officers leading from the front despite the near certainty of becoming casualties. This courage deserves to be honored and remembered. The sacrifice was real and meaningful. The Marines who died at Tarawa died accomplishing their mission. They took an island that was supposed to be impregnable. They proved that American forces could overcome Japanese defenses through determination, training, and sheer willpower. Their deaths were not in vain, even though the cost was terrible. The lessons learned at Tarawa saved lives in later battles. The tactical and operational improvements that came from analyzing what went right and wrong at Tarawa made subsequent amphibious assaults less costly. In this sense, the Marines who died at Tarawa contributed to eventual victory not just by taking the island, but by teaching the American military how to fight this kind of battle more effectively. But Tarawa also raises difficult questions about the cost of war. Was taking this particular island worth over 3,000 American casualties? Could the battle have been fought differently, with better planning, with fewer losses? These questions have been debated by historians and military analysts for decades. The truth is probably that some aspects of the battle could have been handled better. The tide miscalculation was a planning failure that cost lives. Having more amphibious tractors from the start would have reduced casualties. Better intelligence on the reef and tides would have helped. But even with perfect planning, Tarawa would have been costly. The Japanese defenses were formidable. The garrison was determined to fight to the death. Taking the island was going to require direct assault on fortified positions, and that was inevitably going to cost lives. The strategic question, whether the island needed to be taken at all, is more complex. Tarawa was part of the Central Pacific Offensive, which was one prong of the two-pronged American advance toward Japan. Taking the Gilbert Islands provided bases for the next step to the Marshalls. In this sense, Tarawa was strategically necessary, but could it have been bypassed? Could the airfield have been neutralized through bombing rather than invasion? These questions are difficult to answer definitively. Strategy always looks clearer in hindsight than it does in the moment when decisions must be made. What we can say with certainty is that the men who fought at Tarawa did their duty with exceptional courage. They were sent to take an island and they took it. They faced challenges that would have broken lesser forces and they persevered. They suffered casualties that shocked the nation and they kept fighting until the mission was accomplished. This is what makes Tarawa worth remembering. Not because every decision was perfect or every casualty was necessary, but because real people did extraordinary things in the face of extraordinary challenges. Because young men fought and died on that coral island, and their sacrifice deserves to be honored. Tarawa reminds us of the cost of war. It reminds us that victory is not free, that freedom is defended by people who are willing to risk everything. It reminds us that behind every battle, every casualty figure, every strategic objective are individual human beings with families and dreams and futures that were cut short or forever changed. The 76 hours of hell at Tarawa were a microcosm of the Pacific War. Brutal fighting against a determined enemy in hostile conditions. High casualties for seemingly small gains. Courage and sacrifice in the face of nearly impossible odds. Victory achieved at terrible cost. Conclusion: 76 hours. We've reached the end of our journey through the Battle of Tarawa. 76 hours of combat, over 3,000 American casualties, nearly 5,000 Japanese dead, all on an island barely 3 miles long. The battle began before dawn on November 20th, 1943, with the bombardment of Betio. It ended on November 23rd with the island secured and the last organized resistance eliminated. In between was some of the most intense fighting the Marine Corps had experienced. The Marines who stormed Red Beach faced fire unlike anything they had imagined. They waded through chest-deep water while machine guns cut them down. They crossed beaches swept by artillery and mortar fire. They assaulted concrete bunkers that seemed impervious to attack. And they kept going, kept fighting until they had taken the island. The cost was staggering. More than 1,000 Marines killed, over 2,000 wounded. Thousands more affected psychologically by what they experienced. The photographs of American dead on the beach shocked the nation and brought home the reality of Pacific combat. But the mission was accomplished. Betio was taken. The airfield was secured. The first step in the Central Pacific Offensive was complete, and the lessons learned at Tarawa would save lives in later battles, making the sacrifice meaningful even as it remained tragic. Today, more than 80 years after the battle, Tarawa has faded somewhat from public consciousness. It doesn't have the name recognition of D-Day or Iwo Jima. Most Americans have never heard of it. But within the Marine Corps and among military historians, Tarawa holds a special place. It was the first test of amphibious assault against heavily defended beaches. It proved that such assaults were possible, though costly. The island of Betio today is peaceful. The beaches where Marines died are quiet. The bunkers remain, weathered monuments to the battle. Memorials honor both American and Japanese forces. The airfield still operates, though now it serves peaceful purposes. The veterans of Tarawa, those few who still survive, carry their memories. They remember friends who died on that island. They remember the heat and the fire and the fear. They remember being young men doing impossible things because they were ordered to and because their friends needed them to. When the last veteran passes away, and that day is not far off, Tarawa will exist only in the historical record. The photographs, the documents, the recorded interviews will preserve knowledge of the battle. But the living connection, the ability to ask someone who was there, "What was it like?" will be gone. That makes it all the more important to tell the story now, while we can still honor the veterans and learn from their experience. To ensure that Tarawa is not forgotten, that the sacrifice made there is remembered, that future generations understand what happened on that island in November 1943. To the Marines who fought at Tarawa, you did your duty with extraordinary courage. You faced challenges that would have broken lesser men, and you prevailed. You paid a terrible price for victory, but you achieved the mission. You taught the American military how to fight this new kind of warfare. Your sacrifice was not in vain. To the families of those who died at Tarawa, your loss was real and devastating. Your Marines died serving their country, accomplishing their mission, fighting with courage. They are gone, but not forgotten. Their names are on memorials. Their stories are in the historical record, Their sacrifice is honored. To those who survived Tarawa and carried the memory of those 76 hours for the rest of your lives, thank you for your service. Thank you for your courage. Thank you for telling your stories so that future generations could understand. You were there, in hell, and you came through it. You earned your place in history. Tarawa, 76 hours that changed amphibious warfare. 76 hours that tested the Marine Corps and proved its mettle. 76 hours of hell that will be remembered as long as people study courage and sacrifice in warfare. The battle is over. The island is at peace. But the memory remains, preserved in photographs and documents, and in the hearts of those who care about history and honor those who serve. Thank you for listening to this story of Tarawa. May those who fought there be remembered. May those who died there rest in peace. May we never forget the cost of freedom and the price paid by those who defend it. The end.